The German officer didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at her and said calmly, "You have 2 hours." The village square had gone silent. It was early autumn, 1944, a small French town, recently caught between advancing Allied forces and retreating German units. Smoke still hung in the air from artillery exchanges outside the hills. Her commander, Captain Henri Valois, stood restrained near the fountain in the center of the square. He had refused to give up supply routes used by the resistance. Now the German field unit had issued a public ultimatum. 2 hours. If no one cooperated, the captain would be executed as a warning. She stood in the crowd, fists trembling. Lieutenant Claire Moreau. Young, precise, calm, under fire, but this wasn't the battlefield. This was psychological warfare. The German major stepped closer to her. "You are second in command," he said quietly. "You understand what must be done." He wanted information, names, routes, contacts. He believed pressure would break her. The clock began ticking. Villagers avoided eye contact. No one spoke. The church bell rang once in the distance, a reminder that time was moving. Claire stepped forward. "I want to speak to him," she said. The German officer smiled slightly. 30 minutes, he replied. As she walked toward Captain Valois, soldiers shifted their rifles. Not aiming, just reminding. The captain looked exhausted, but steady. "You know what they want," he said softly. She nodded. "You have 2 hours, he added. "No," she whispered. "They have 2 hours." And that was the moment everything changed. The room was smaller than she imagined. Heavy wooden desk, one window, curtains half drawn. The ticking of a metal wall clock sounded louder than artillery. Captain Valois sat in a chair near the wall, hands restrained but posture straight. He looked tired, but not defeated. 2 German guards stood near the door. The major remained behind his desk, watching. Claire stepped inside. The door closed. The sound echoed. "You have 30 minutes, the major said calmly. She didn't respond. She walked past him, slowly, and stopped in front of her commander. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Valois leaned slightly forward. "They want routes," he said quietly, "and names." "I know." His eyes searched hers. "They think fear works faster than loyalty." Outside, through the window, church bells rang once, time passing. The German major lit a cigarette. The flame briefly illuminated his face in sharp contrast. "You are practical," he said to Claire. "Your commander is emotional." She didn't look at him. "You have 2 hours, he repeated. "Give us what we need." And he walks out alive. Silence. Claire finally turned toward him. "You're making a mistake," she said. The major smirked. "Oh?" "You assume we're reacting." The cigarette paused halfway to his lips. "What does that mean?" Claire stepped closer to the desk. 2 hours is a long time. The guards shifted slightly. The major narrowed his eyes. "You think someone is coming?" "No," she replied calmly. "I know." The room went still. Even the ticking clock seemed to hesitate. The major stood up slowly. "You're bluffing." She didn't blink. "You chose a public ultimatum," she said evenly. "You gathered villagers. You made it visible." He said nothing. "You didn't do that for information." Now his expression changed, just slightly. "You did it," she continued, "because you're worried." The guards looked at each other. Valois said nothing, but his eyes widened just a fraction. The major slammed his hand lightly on the desk. "You have 1 hour and 40 minutes left." Claire leaned in, just enough to lower her voice. "No." She held his gaze. "You have 1 hour and 40 minutes." And for the first time since she entered the room, the major wasn't smiling. The major tried to regain control of the room. "You're stalling," he said coldly. Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the village square looked calm. Too calm. Farm carts, a few villagers, German patrols pretending not to watch. But she wasn't looking at them. She was listening. Far in the distance. Barely audible. A low rumble. Not artillery, not yet. The major noticed her expression change. Just slightly. "You're expecting reinforcements," he said. She turned. "No." She stepped closer to the desk. "I'm expecting impatience." He narrowed his eyes. Valois watched her carefully now. He understood something was happening, but not what. Claire placed both hands on the desk and leaned forward just enough to lower her voice. "You made a public threat," she said quietly. "You announced a deadline." "Yes." "And you believe that gives you power." The major's jaw tightened. "It does." She shook her head slightly. "It gives you a clock." The room went silent again. One of the guards glanced at the wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. "You think I fear time?" the major asked. "I think," she replied calmly, "you fear what happens when time runs out." Outside, another distant vibration, this time stronger. The major walked toward the window himself. Nothing visible, just a horizon line of trees, but something was changing in the air. Claire straightened her posture. "You've been pulling units back all week," she said. "Your supply trucks stopped arriving yesterday." He didn't respond. "You're not holding this town," she continued evenly. "You're passing through." The guards stiffened. Valois now understood. She wasn't stalling. She was exposing him. "You gave a public ultimatum," she said, "because you needed control." The major turned sharply. "And you believe I don't have it." She held his gaze. "I believe," she said slowly, "you have 2 hours to leave." The words hit harder than any shout. The rumble outside grew louder now, clearer. Engines, multiple. Not inside the town, but approaching. The major walked back to the desk, slower this time. "You're gambling," he said. "No." She shook her head. "I calculated." He stared at her, trying to find doubt. There was none. Another officer rushed into the room suddenly. "Sir!" He stopped when he saw Claire. The major didn't look at him. "Report. Movement on the western ridge." Silence. "How many?" "Unclear." Claire didn't smile. She didn't need to. The major finally looked at her differently now. Not as a prisoner, not as a subordinate, but as a strategist. "You planned this," he said quietly. She answered just as quietly. "No." She glanced at the clock. "You forced it." The engines outside were no longer distant. The deadline was no longer theoretical. And for the first time since the ultimatum, the power in the room had shifted. The engines were no longer distant. They were real, low, heavy, mechanical. Not chaos, not panic. Organized movement. The German officer near the door swallowed hard. "Western Ridge confirmed," he said quietly. "Multiple vehicles." The major didn't look away from Claire. "How many?" he asked again. 4, maybe 5. Transport trucks, not tanks, but enough to change the balance. Claire didn't move. She let the silence work. The major walked toward the window again, this time pulling the curtain aside slightly. Dust rising in the distance, a faint glint of sunlight against metal. He calculated quickly. 4 or 5 trucks meant infantry support. Infantry support meant advance pressure. Advance pressure meant one thing. The town was no longer strategically irrelevant. He turned back toward her. "You said you weren't expecting reinforcements." "I'm not," she replied calmly. The engines grew louder. The guards shifted, unsure whether to leave the room or stay. Valois finally spoke. "You made this public," he reminded the major quietly. "You gathered the town." The major ignored him, but he understood the implication. If he executed a prisoner now, and Allied forces entered within the hour, he would lose the town and the narrative. Claire stepped closer to the desk. "You needed fear," she said evenly. "You wanted control." His jaw tightened. "And you," he said slowly, "are trying to buy time." "No." She shook her head slightly. "I'm selling it." The words lingered in the air. Outside, boots could now be heard in the corridor. More German soldiers. Movement. Confusion spreading through the building. Another officer entered the room. "Sir, radio contact is unstable. We're receiving reports of forward units repositioning." "Retreating?" the major asked sharply. "Strategic shift, sir." That was enough. The major looked at Claire again, but differently now. She wasn't a hostage. She wasn't leverage. She was a variable. "You calculated arrival time," he said. "Yes." "And you gambled that I wouldn't risk public action." "Yes." The engines were very close now, close enough to shake the glass in the window slightly. Valois leaned back in his chair. 2 hours, he said quietly. The major looked at the clock. 1 hour and 12 minutes remained. He had issued the ultimatum to demonstrate authority. But now, every minute that passed weakened it. Claire stepped back slightly, not retreating, just steady. "If you execute him now," she said calmly, "you lose control." "If I release him," the major replied, "I appear weak." She held his gaze. "Only if you stay." The corridor outside erupted briefly with hurried footsteps. A voice shouted something indistinct. The major closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He understood the trap. Not a military trap, a political one, a psychological one. Claire had turned his deadline into a countdown against him. He opened his eyes. "You are very certain," he said quietly. "No," she answered. "I'm very patient." The engines outside finally stopped. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncertain. No one in the room moved. And then, a distant echo. Not gunfire, not yet, but a signal flare rising somewhere beyond the ridge. The color wasn't visible from here, but the message was clear. Something had begun. The major walked slowly back to his desk. He placed both hands on it, and, for the first time, he looked unsure. The engines stopped. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. For a few seconds, no one in the room moved. Then, a knock at the door. Not frantic, not panicked, measured. One of the guards opened it slightly. A German sergeant stepped in, face tight. "Sir, vehicles confirmed." The major didn't look away from Claire. "Identify." The sergeant hesitated. "Not allied." The air shifted. Valois' expression changed. Claire did not react. "Repeat," the major said slowly. "Rear logistics convoy, sir. Redirected from the southern route." The rumble hadn't been liberation. It had been supply. The major finally allowed himself a small breath. Then he looked at Claire. "You calculated incorrectly." "No," she replied calmly. "I calculated pressure." The major walked toward the window again. Dust clouds still lingered over the ridge as the trucks rolled into the outskirts of town. He turned back. "You tried to bluff." "No." She met his eyes evenly. "I accelerated your timeline." The clock ticked loudly. 1 hour and 4 minutes left. The major moved back behind the desk, slower now. "You assumed I would hesitate." "I assumed you would think," she corrected. The sergeant remained at the door, uneasy. "Sir, the convoy commander requests instructions. They weren't informed about the public action." The words mattered. Public action. The major understood the implication instantly. If his own logistics officers questioned the execution, if internal doubt spread, control would fracture from within. Claire saw the realization in his eyes. "You see it now," she said quietly. He didn't respond. Outside, German soldiers were already speaking among themselves. Supply trucks meant transition. Transition meant movement. Movement meant retreat or redeployment. This was no longer a stable command post. It was temporary. Valois leaned forward slightly. "You don't want witnesses," he said calmly. The major turned sharply. Silence. But he was thinking. Executing a prisoner during a repositioning phase would not strengthen authority. It would complicate it. Claire stepped closer again, but not aggressively. "You chose a spectacle," she said softly. "But your own men didn't." The major stared at her. "You are very dangerous for someone without a weapon." She held his gaze. "I never needed one." Outside, another officer hurried past the open doorway. "Sir, Western radio line just reported increased Allied patrol activity beyond the ridge." The major's jaw tightened again. Supply trucks inside, Allied patrols outside, unstable communications, a public ultimatum ticking down. Claire had not predicted the convoy, but she didn't need to. She had predicted tension, and tension was now everywhere. The major looked at the clock again. 58 minutes remaining. He walked slowly around the desk, stopped in front of her. Close. "You risked his life on probability." "Yes." "And you would have watched him die if you were wrong?" Her voice did not tremble. "I would have watched you collapse your own command." Silence. The guards avoided eye contact. The sergeant stepped back slightly. The major studied her carefully now, not as an opponent, as a strategist. "You don't win battles," he said quietly. "You destabilize them." She did not smile. "Every command breaks," she replied, "under the right pressure." Outside, the church bell rang again. 1 hour left. The ultimatum he had announced so confidently now felt like a weight around his own neck, and he knew it. He returned slowly to his desk, sat down, looked at the papers in front of him, then at Claire, then at Valois. The engines had arrived, but the real pressure had only just begun. The room felt smaller now, not because of walls, because of pressure. The major sat still for nearly 10 seconds. No one spoke. The ticking clock had become unbearable. 52 minutes remaining. He finally stood up. "Clear the corridor," he ordered calmly. The guards hesitated. "Sir?" "Clear it." Boots moved quickly. Voices faded. The hallway outside grew quieter. He didn't want witnesses anymore. That alone was a shift. Claire noticed. "You're reconsidering," she said softly. "I am recalculating," he corrected. He walked toward the desk and picked up the written notice of execution, the one prepared for public display. He read it again. Formal language, public compliance, 2-hour deadline, authority in ink. But authority depended on certainty, and certainty was dissolving. "Your reinforcements did not arrive," he said without looking up. "No," Claire replied evenly, "but neither did yours." He folded the paper slowly. Outside, one of the newly arrived logistics officers was arguing quietly with a field sergeant. Not rebellion, but disagreement. Disagreement was enough. The major understood something dangerous now. His own unit had not been informed about the public ultimatum. That meant the execution was personal, not strategic. Claire stepped slightly closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. "You issued a deadline to create obedience," she said quietly. "Yes. And now the deadline creates instability." His eyes lifted to meet hers. "You are pushing," he said. "I'm observing." He walked around the desk again, slower this time, measured steps. "You assume I cannot afford to carry this through." "I assume," she replied calmly, "you cannot afford the consequences." Valois watched the exchange carefully. For the first time, hope flickered, but he hid it well. The major stopped in front of Claire again, very close. "You believe time is my enemy. I believe visibility is." That word lingered. Visibility. The town square. The gathered villagers. The convoy that just arrived. Officers not briefed. Radio instability. And now, almost 1 hour into the ultimatum, no action taken. The longer he waited, the weaker the threat became. He turned toward the window once more. The trucks outside were unloading supplies. Fuel, crates, maps. A sign of movement, not permanence. A young German lieutenant entered cautiously. "Sir, Western radio reports confirm Allied patrol units within 5 kilometers. "How many?" "Unclear, sir." Claire did not move, but she knew what that meant. 5 kilometers meant contact possible within the hour. The major looked at the clock again. 45 minutes remaining. If he executed Valois now, The action would be rushed. If he waited longer, it would look reactive. If he canceled it, it would look weak. Every option now carried risk. Claire spoke carefully. You can still redefine the narrative. He looked at her sharply. How? You convert a punishment into a transfer. Silence. The guards near the door exchanged glances. You withdraw him for questioning, she continued calmly. No spectacle. No deadline. The major studied her face. You offer me a way out. I offer you control. Outside, a distant thud echoed. Not artillery. A signal flare. Different direction this time. The logistics officers stopped arguing. Everyone looked toward the ridge. The major exhaled slowly. You manipulate momentum, he said quietly. No, she answered. I read it. The clock ticked again. 42 minutes. The ultimatum had become fragile. Not because of force, because of doubt. And doubt spreads faster than fear. The major walked back behind his desk, sat down, folded his hands, looked directly at Claire. You are not trying to save him, he said carefully. You are trying to win. She held his gaze. No, she said. I'm trying to survive. Another pause. Then, he reached for the execution notice, but instead of signing it, he placed it in a drawer, slowly, deliberately. The guards noticed. Valois noticed. Claire did not react outwardly, but internally. The balance had shifted. The deadline no longer controlled the room. He did, and that meant she had succeeded. But outside, the ridge was not quiet, and the next move would not be psychological. The document stayed in the drawer. No signature, no public announcement, no execution. For a moment, the room held its breath. The major sat motionless behind his desk, staring at nothing in particular, but thinking fast. Outside, the atmosphere had changed. German soldiers were repositioning. Logistics officers were giving hurried instructions. Radio chatter had grown sharper. Allied patrol units were no longer a rumor. They were real. 40 minutes remained on the clock, but the ultimatum had already expired. Not in time, in authority. The major finally stood up. Remove the restraints, he ordered quietly. The guards hesitated. Sir? Remove them. Valois' hands were freed slowly. The rope fell to the floor. Claire did not move. The major walked around the desk one final time. You forced a strategic recalibration, he said evenly. I forced clarity, she replied. He studied her face. You risked everything. Yes. For one man? She glanced briefly at Valois, then back at him. For stability. Outside, a distant echo rolled across the ridge, this time unmistakable. Allied advance units had engaged somewhere beyond the trees. Not a full assault, but close enough. The major understood what would happen next. If he carried out the execution now, it would not intimidate anyone. It would look desperate, and desperation spreads. He walked toward the window and pulled the curtain fully aside. Dust clouds were visible near the western approach. Movement. Shadows between trees. He exhaled slowly. You win this town, he said without turning. No. Claire answered calmly. You chose not to lose it. That was the difference. He turned back toward her. For the first time, there was no hostility in his expression, only calculation. Captain Valois will be transferred, he announced. No public action, no deadline. The guards straightened. The decision was made, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Claire allowed herself the smallest breath. Valois stepped forward slightly. You spared yourself, he said quietly. The major looked at him. I preserved order. Another distant sound echoed from outside, closer now. German units were preparing to withdraw from outer positions. The town would change hands soon. Everyone in the room knew it. The major picked up his gloves from the desk. You understand something, he said to Claire. She waited. Power is not loud. She nodded slightly. Neither is control. He gave one short, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned toward the door. "Prepare relocation," he ordered. Boots moved quickly again, but this time, not with certainty, with transition. Claire stepped closer to Valois. "You calculated correctly," he whispered. "No," she replied quietly. "I calculated him." Outside, the church bell rang again. Not in warning, in continuity. Within the hour, the first Allied scouts would enter the edge of town. There would be no execution site, no public spectacle, only a command that dissolved quietly under pressure. The major paused once at the doorway. Without looking back, he said, "You gave me 2 hours." Claire answered evenly. "You gave yourself one choice." He walked out, and the deadline that had begun as a threat ended as a lesson. The end.